This is the species that dared resist our advance. Jorian's voice dripped with contempt, each syllable sharp and deliberate. The ambient hum of the ship's control systems did little to soften the chill that spread through the command deck. Officers at their stations stiffened, hesitant under the Admiral's scrutiny, before quickly resuming their work, eager to avoid drawing his ire. "Primitive at best, sir," Lieutenant Yakrin replied, standing rigidly a few paces behind him. The younger officer, clad in the gleaming armor of the Mazoran Guard, the Empire's most elite force, spoke with the confidence of one well-versed in conquest. Yet beneath that veneer, a note of unease crept into his voice. Their technology is archaic. Kinetic projectile weapons, combustion-driven vehicles, rudimentary defenses. They pose no real threat. Jorian turned, his silver eyes narrowing. And yet they persist. His gaze was cold, assessing, the glint of irritation unmistakable. Persistence in the weak, Lieutenant, is like rotten wood. Left unchecked, it spreads and festers into something far more troublesome. Yakrin inclined his head in agreement, but his silence was telling. He had served under Jorian long enough to know when to hold his tongue. The Admiral's words carried weight, but something about this species gnawed at the edges of his confidence. They had crushed countless civilizations before, bending entire worlds to the will of the Empire. But these humans, these supposed primitives, were unlike any adversary they had faced. Others had capitulated the moment they realized the vast technological chasm between them and the Mazoran fleet. Humanity, however, refused to surrender. That, in itself, was an anomaly. A holographic display flickered to life before them, casting an eerie blue glow across the command chamber. The image zoomed in on a war-torn cityscape where a contingent of Imperial forces had engaged human resistance fighters. The battle was a foregone conclusion. Even as Yakrin observed, Imperial troops, clad in impenetrable armor, advanced methodically through the shattered remains of a once-thriving metropolis. Plasma fire cut through makeshift barricades with ease, and energy shields rendered the humans' crude firearms all but useless. Outmatched in every conceivable way, the defenders fell back, their retreat chaotic, driven more by instinct than strategy. "Watch," Jorian commanded, his gaze locked onto the projection. Yakrin obeyed, his eyes tracing the unfolding scene. As expected, the humans were being routed. Yet there was something unsettling in the way they fought. Not with strategy, not with the disciplined cohesion of a trained military, but with a sheer, reckless ferocity that defied logic. "They're insects," Jorian muttered, the disdain in his voice palpable, scurrying through the ruins of their own world, clinging to some pathetic notion that resistance means anything. Yakrin hesitated before speaking. "Admiral, they're disorganized, yes, but there's an unpredictability to their tactics. It is worth noting." Jorian's expression darkened. "Unpredictability is the excuse of the inept, Lieutenant. These creatures are throwing stones at a fortress. There is no strategy here. Only the last gasps of a species too ignorant to accept its fate." Yakrin remained silent, but his gaze lingered on the battle. The last remnants of the human defenders attempted to flee, their movements frantic, desperate, and yet not without purpose. His attention caught on a lone soldier, his uniform streaked with blood and soot, dragging a wounded comrade across the rubble-strewn ground. The man's breathing was labored, his body battered, yet he paused, just for a moment, to raise his rifle and fire blindly at the advancing Mazoran troops. The shot was futile, barely an annoyance against their shields. And still, he did not hesitate. Something about that image unsettled Yakrin in a way he could not explain. "Desperation," Jorian scoffed. "The final, pitiful defiance of a doomed species." Yakrin exhaled slowly, watching as the human soldier disappeared into the ruins, the glow of his rifle fire flickering like a dying ember in the darkness. "Desperation," he murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible. "Or determination?" The scene shifted again as the hologram dissolved, replaced by a broader view of Earth. The admiral stepped forward, his long coat trailing behind him like a shadow. "Begin the next phase of deployment," he ordered. "We'll crush their remaining strongholds and make an example of them. The galaxy will see the cost of opposing the Empire." "Yes, Admiral," Yakrin replied, though his mind was elsewhere. He had seen countless species fall to the Empire's might, but something about these humans felt different. It wasn't their technology, he agreed with Jorian on that point, but their sheer refusal to yield, even in the face of overwhelming odds, was unsettling. He couldn't shake the feeling that underestimating them might be a mistake. Far below, on the planet's surface, Captain John Joseph surveyed the ruins of the city from his position in a half-collapsed building. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the streets, mingling with the acrid scent of smoke and scorched metal. He adjusted the strap of his rifle, his sharp features set in grim determination. "They're pushing harder," said Private Josh, a young soldier crouched nearby. His voice was tight with fear, but he kept his weapon steady as he scanned the street below. "We can't hold them off much longer, sir." Joseph nodded, his mind racing. He had seen the reports of the Empire's technological superiority, armor impervious to small arms fire, weapons that could vaporize a tank in seconds. But he had also seen the cracks in their facade. They were overconfident, relying on their superior firepower to steamroll opposition. That arrogance was their weakness. "They think we're beaten," Joseph said, his voice low but firm. "Let's show them they're wrong." He turned to the handful of soldiers still with him, their faces marked by exhaustion but not defeat. "We're going to fall back to the old subway tunnels. Josh, you take point. Keep the comms silent unless it's critical. They'll be looking for us, but they won't expect us to fight on our terms." The soldiers nodded, their trust in Joseph evident despite the odds stacked against them. As they moved out, Joseph lingered for a moment, gazing up at the sky where the faint outline of the Phoenix was just visible. He knew this fight was far from over, and the losses would be staggering. But if the Empire thought humanity would roll over and die quietly, they were in for a rude awakening. Back on the flagship, Jorian dismissed the latest reports from the ground as inconsequential. "Increase the pressure," he ordered his officers. "We'll grind them into dust." Yakrin said nothing, but his unease grew. In his mind, the image of the human soldier dragging his comrade to safety lingered, a stark contrast to the Empire's cold efficiency. For the first time, he wondered if their victory was as assured as the Admiral believed. The valley stretched out before them, quiet and foreboding under the pale light of dawn. Captain John Joseph crouched low behind a jagged outcropping of rock, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain ahead. The Imperial troops would come soon, their movements as predictable as the tides. He had studied their patterns, learned their arrogance by heart. They marched in tight formations, confident in their advanced armor and overwhelming firepower. They believed themselves untouchable, and that belief was their greatest weakness. Behind him, a small team of soldiers worked in hushed urgency, setting up mortars in the shallow trench they'd carved into the earth. The weapons looked old, their metal scratched and dulled from years of use, but Joseph knew their value. High technology didn't matter here. What mattered was strategy, timing, and the resolve of those who fought. Private Josh, crouched beside the captain, adjusted his helmet nervously. "Do you think they'll fall for it, sir?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Joseph didn't answer immediately. He watched the horizon, the distant glint of sunlight catching on metal signaling the enemy's approach. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady. "They'll come. They always do. And when they do, we'll be ready." The soldiers nodded, their faces drawn but determined. They had learned to trust Joseph's instincts, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He had led them through impossible situations before, always finding a way to exploit the Empire's blind spots. This time will be no different. Far above, aboard the Phoenix, Admiral Jorian stood before the Central Command Console, watching a tactical display of the advancing Imperial forces. The holographic map flickered with precise data points, showing the position of their troops and the retreating human resistance. Jorian's expression was one of quiet satisfaction. Another pocket of resistance identified and contained, he remarked, his voice carrying the faintest trace of boredom. How many times must we play this game before they accept the inevitable? Lieutenant Yakrin stood nearby, his stance rigid. He hesitated before responding, his thoughts uneasy. Sir, the humans have been retreating strategically. They could be luring us into an ambush. Jorian turned to him sharply, his silver eyes narrowing. An ambush? With what, Lieutenant? Sticks and stones? Their tactics are as rudimentary as their weapons. Yakrin's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. He had seen enough of humanity's resistance to know they weren't to be underestimated. The humans fought like cornered animals, striking where it hurt most and vanishing before the Empire could retaliate. It was a far cry from the overwhelming battles the Empire was accustomed to. On the ground, the rhythmic sound of boots crunching against the rocky terrain filled the air as the Mazoran Guard advanced. Clad in sleek, black armor that shimmered faintly with energy shielding, the soldiers moved with mechanical precision. Their leader, a grizzled veteran named Commander Zoran, marched at the front, his plasma rifle slung across his chest. Scanners show no significant heat signatures ahead, reported one of the scouts, his voice crackling over the comms. The humans have retreated further into the valley. Cowards, Zoran muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. Advance and flush them out. This ends today. The troops spread out, their formation tightening as they entered the narrow confines of the valley. Jagged cliffs rose on either side, casting long shadows over the marching soldiers. It was an ideal choke point, but the Empire's confidence blinded them to the danger. From his vantage point, Joseph watched the Imperial troops funnel into the valley. He counted their numbers silently, noting their positions and the gaps in their formation. The mortar teams waited for his signal, their hands steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Hold, Joseph whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. The soldiers around him shifted, their fingers twitching on their triggers. The waiting was always the hardest part. Below, the first wave of Imperial troops moved closer, their footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. The Mazoran Guard, with their energy shields and advanced weaponry, were the Empire's pride. But here, in the rugged terrain of Earth, their superiority meant little. Joseph raised a hand, and the soldiers around him stiffened. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the perfect moment. Timing was everything. Fire! The first mortar round arced through the air, its whistle cutting through the silence like a blade. It struck the ground in the center of the advancing troops, detonating with a thunderous roar. The explosion sent shockwaves through the valley, shattering the Empire's disciplined ranks. Before the dust could settle, more rounds followed. The air filled with a deafening cacophony of explosions, the sharp cracks of rifles, and the screams of disoriented soldiers. The Mazoran Guard, so confident in their invulnerability, scrambled for cover. Their energy shields flickered and failed under the relentless barrage, their armor offering little protection against the shrapnel that tore through their ranks. Joseph watched the chaos unfold with a grim sense of satisfaction. The mortars were old, their range limited, but in these tight quarters, they were devastatingly effective. The Empire had walked right into the trap, their arrogance blinding them to the possibility of defeat. On the flagship, Jorian's calm demeanor cracked as reports of the ambush flooded in. "What is happening down there?" he demanded, his voice sharp with anger. "Enemy artillery, sir," a junior officer stammered. "They're using mortars." Jorian's eyes narrowed. "Mortars? You're telling me our elite troops are being decimated by primitive explosives?" "It's more effective than we anticipated," the officer admitted, shrinking under the Admiral's glare. Yakrin stepped forward, his expression neutral. "I warned you, Admiral. The humans are unpredictable. They're using the terrain and our assumptions against us." Jorian rounded on him, his voice icy. "Do not mistake a momentary setback for anything more. Crush them." Back in the valley, the Imperials attempted to regroup, their commanders shouting orders over the chaos. Joseph seized the opportunity, signaling his men to press the attack. They moved swiftly through the rubble, striking at isolated pockets of resistance before melting back into the shadows. The battle raged on, the once imposing Mazoran guard reduced to a desperate fight for survival. Joseph's soldiers, emboldened by their success, fought with renewed vigor. For the first time, the Empire's troops looked vulnerable. As the sun began to set, casting the valley in blood-red hues, the remnants of the Imperial forces retreated, their once proud formation in shambles. Joseph watched them go, his face expressionless. He knew this was just the beginning. The Empire would not take this defeat lightly. Still, for now, they had won. "Good work," Joseph said quietly, turning to his men. "But don't get comfortable. They'll be back and they'll be angry." Far above, Jorian stared at the tactical display, his hands clenched into fists. The humans had struck a blow to the Empire's pride, and that was something he would not forgive. Yaakrin, standing silently at the Admiral's side, felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: respect. The humans had done the impossible, and something told him this was far from over. The air smelled of cordite and scorched earth as Captain John Joseph crouched behind a crumbled wall, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Smoke coiled in dark plumes against the fading light of the evening, casting a grim pall over the battered landscape. Around him, his men moved with practiced efficiency, reloading mortars and securing defensive positions. They were exhausted, their uniforms torn and faces streaked with grime, but their eyes carried a spark that hadn't been there days ago, the glint of belief. Joseph checked his watch, his expression hardening. The Empire would regroup, as they always did, but their reaction this time would be swift and merciless. He turned to Private Josh, who knelt nearby, adjusting the sights on a battered mortar. "How are we on ammunition?" Joseph asked, his voice low but steady. "Running low, sir," Josh replied, not looking up. "We've got enough for a couple more barges, but that's it." After that, he trailed off, his meaning clear. Joseph nodded, already calculating their next move. He could hear the distant hum of Imperial gunships approaching, a sound that had become all too familiar. This battle wasn't about holding ground. It was about making every inch the Empire took cost them dearly. Across the battlefield, the remnants of the Mazoran Guard regrouped in a narrow gorge. Commander Zoran, his armor scorched and dented, barked orders at his soldiers. The once imposing force had been reduced to a ragged shadow of itself, their confidence shaken by the humans' relentless attacks. "Reinforcements are en route," Zoran growled into his comms. "Hold the line until they arrive." The soldiers nodded grimly, their earlier bravado replaced by grim determination. Zoran knew they couldn't afford another failure. The Admiral's wrath was nothing compared to the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by a species the Empire had deemed inferior. High above, aboard the Phoenix, Admiral Jorian watched the unfolding battle with simmering fury. The humans' tactics defied the Empire's understanding of warfare, and the reports of their effectiveness gnawed at his pride. "Admiral, their forces are concentrated in the southern sector," an officer reported. "If we deploy orbital strikes—" "No," Jorian interrupted, his tone icy. "We will not resort to brute force. This is a matter of principle now. Deploy the auxiliary ground units and eliminate them. I want survivors brought back for interrogation." Lieutenant Yaakrin stood silently to one side, his expression unreadable. He had spent the last few days studying the humans' tactics, piecing together their strategy. It was clear now that their victories weren't luck. They were the result of meticulous planning and adaptability. "Permission to lead the ground forces, Admiral," Yaakrin said suddenly. Jorian turned to him, his silver eyes narrowing. "And why would I, Joseph, that?" Yaakrin met his gaze without flinching. "Because I understand what we're facing. If we continue underestimating them, they will bleed us dry. Allow me to neutralize their leadership before this becomes an embarrassment." Jorian's jaw tightened, but after a moment he nodded. "Very well. Do not fail me, Lieutenant." On the ground, Joseph adjusted the strap of his rifle and moved to where Sergeant Rourke was coordinating the defensive line. The older soldier saluted briskly, his face as weathered as the ruins around them. "They're coming again, sir," Rourke said grimly. "Scouts spotted movement along the eastern ridge. Looks like they're trying to flank us." Joseph frowned, his mind racing. The Imperial forces had adapted faster than he'd expected, adjusting their formations and probing for weaknesses. But their arrogance remained, a flaw he intended to exploit. "Pull back the forward squads and let them think they've found an opening," Joseph ordered. "Set charges along the ridge and keep the mortars ready. When they commit, we hit them hard." Rourke nodded, a thin smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Understood, sir. They won't know what hit them." The minutes stretched into tense anticipation as the humans prepared for the next assault. Every sound, a distant explosion, the crackle of a dying fire, seemed magnified in the heavy silence. Josh glanced at Joseph, his fingers drumming nervously on the stock of his rifle. "You think this'll work, Captain?" Joseph's gaze remained fixed on the ridge. "It has to." The first Imperial units appeared on the eastern slope, their dark forms moving with mechanical precision. They advanced cautiously, their weapons scanning for threats, but the terrain worked against them. Loose rocks and narrow paths slowed their progress, forcing them into a vulnerable column. Joseph waited until the bulk of the enemy force had committed before giving the signal. The charges detonated in a blinding flash, sending a cascade of boulders and debris crashing down the slope. The sound was deafening, a roar that echoed across the valley and drowned out the screams of the trapped soldiers. Before the dust had settled, the mortars opened fire. Shells rained down with brutal accuracy, shattering what remained of the Imperial formation. The once disciplined troops dissolved into chaos, their energy shields flickering uselessly against the relentless assault. Joseph's men pressed the advantage, striking from concealed positions and vanishing before the Empire could mount a counterattack. Every move was calculated, every strike designed to sow confusion and fear. From his position on the ridge, Yaakrin watched the scene unfold with growing unease. The humans were unlike any enemy he had faced before. They fought not with brute force, but with ingenuity and precision, exploiting every weakness in the Empire's armor. "They've turned this battlefield into a trap," Yaakrin muttered, his admiration grudging but genuine. Beside him, an Imperial officer adjusted his visor. "Shall we call for an orbital strike, sir?" Yaakrin shook his head. "No. If we rely on that now, we'll lose more than this battle. We need to break their spirit, not their bodies." As the last echoes of the skirmish faded, Joseph regrouped with his soldiers in a sheltered alcove. They were bloodied and battered, but their eyes shone with a fierce pride. "We did it, sir," Josh said, his voice filled with awe. "We actually drove them back." Joseph gave a faint smile, though his mind remained focused on the next move. "For now, but they'll come harder next time. They always do." In the distance, the faint glow of the phoenix hung like a malevolent star, a reminder that the Empire's power was far from broken. Yaakrin's gaze lingered on the battlefield, his thoughts conflicted. He had come here to crush the humans, to demonstrate the Empire's dominance. But what he saw instead was a species that refused to break, no matter the odds. "They're more dangerous than we realized," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of respect. The officer beside him glanced over. "What do we do now, sir?" Yaakrin's lips pressed into a thin line. "We adapt." The battle wasn't over. Far from it. But for the first time, the Empire's finest knew the taste of uncertainty. The battlefield was eerily silent in the wake of the latest skirmish, a stark contrast to the chaos and bloodshed that had filled the valley only hours before. Captain John Joseph stood at the edge of the shattered ridge, his silhouette framed against the glow of distant fires. Below, the remnants of the Imperial forces scrambled to regroup, their formations disjointed and their confidence shaken. Joseph's men gathered around him, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination. The battle had pushed them to their limits, but they had held their ground. Now, they stood on the cusp of something unthinkable, forcing the mighty Galactic Empire to retreat. "They'll come again," Private Josh murmured, his voice hoarse from the smoke-filled air. "And they'll be angrier this time." Joseph nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "Let them. The angrier they are, the more mistakes they'll make." Far above, Aboard the Phoenix, Admiral Jorian paced the command deck, his usual composure shattered by the string of humiliations his forces had suffered. Reports of casualties and equipment losses poured in, each one a bitter reminder of the humans' resilience. "How can this be happening?" he growled, slamming a gloved fist onto the console. "They're primitives. Their weapons belong in a museum." Lieutenant Yakrin stood nearby, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "They're not primitives, Admiral. They're survivors. And survivors learn to use whatever they have to its fullest potential." Jorian rounded on him, his silver eyes blazing. "Are you suggesting we're outmatched?" Yakrin shook his head. "No, but we've been outthought. They've turned every strength of ours into a liability. It's time we stop underestimating them." The Admiral sneered but said nothing, his pride warring with the cold logic of Yakrin's words. Finally, he turned to the tactical display where the battered remnants of the Imperial forces were highlighted in stark red. "Deploy the heavy armor and air support," Jorian ordered. "End this farce. I want no survivors." Yakrin stiffened but saluted. "Yes, Admiral." On the ground, the hum of approaching gunships broke the silence, their sleek forms casting long shadows over the ruined valley. Joseph's jaw tightened as he watched the Empire's reinforcements arrive, massive walkers bristling with weapons, flanked by squadrons of heavily armed soldiers. "This is it," he said quietly, turning to his men. "Their last push. If we break them here, we send a message they'll never forget." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. They were outnumbered and outgunned, their ammunition nearly spent. But they had come too far to back down now. "Set the traps," Joseph ordered, "and hold your positions. No matter what happens, we make them pay for every step." The Imperial forces advanced with methodical precision, their heavy armor rumbling across the rocky terrain. Overhead, gunships rained plasma fire on the humans' positions, forcing them to scatter and seek cover. But even as the Empire pressed its advantage, Joseph's men struck back with a ferocity born of desperation. Explosions tore through the enemy's advance, the carefully placed charges detonating with devastating precision. Fire and shrapnel engulfed the towering walkers, their legs sheared apart in violent bursts, sending the massive war machines crashing to the ground. From hidden vantage points, human mortar teams unleashed relentless barrages, their shells finding weak points in the soldiers' energy shields and tearing through Imperial ranks with ruthless efficiency. At the rear of the battlefield, Yakrin observed the unfolding chaos with a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration. The humans fought with a brutal ingenuity, leveraging the terrain and exploiting the Empire's reliance on technology with startling effectiveness. "They've turned this valley into a death trap," he muttered, his grip tightening around his rifle. Amid the cacophony of battle, Joseph spotted a critical vulnerability. The Empire's forces, fixated on overwhelming the human defenses, had left their supply lines dangerously exposed. He turned to Sergeant Rourke, who crouched beside him, his face set in grim determination. "Take a team and hit their supply line," Joseph ordered, his voice low but firm. "Disrupt their reinforcements, cut off their retreat. Make sure they can't regroup." Rourke gave a sharp nod. "Consider it done, Captain." Moving swiftly through the rugged terrain, the sergeant and his team approached the Imperial convoy with practiced precision. They struck hard and fast, detonating ammunition caches and disabling key transport vehicles before slipping back into the shadows, leaving fire and confusion in their wake. The effect was immediate. Panic rippled through the Imperial ranks as their advance faltered, commanders scrambling to regain control. Supply shortages compounded their mounting losses, and the once-coordinated assault began to unravel. Yakrin sensed the shift and knew what had to be done. "Fall back," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of command. "We've lost the initiative. Pull the troops back to a defensible position." The officers around him hesitated, their expressions flickering with shock. "But sir," the Admiral, "will understand once I explain." Yakrin snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Do it." Reluctantly, the Imperial forces began to withdraw, their once imposing presence now reduced to scattered units scrambling for cover. Above, aboard the command ship, Jorian watched the retreat unfold, his silver eyes dark with fury. "What are they doing?" he demanded, his voice edged with barely contained rage. "Why are they retreating?" A nervous officer swallowed hard. "Lieutenant Yakran ordered it, sir." Jorian's fists curled into tight knots. "He's a coward. I'll have his head for this." On the ground, Joseph and his men watched the enemy's retreat, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of an impossible victory. There were no wild cheers, only quiet relief and the grim understanding that this was just one battle in a much longer war. Joseph allowed himself a rare smile. Though his gaze remained sharp, his mind already calculating the next move. They had held their ground. They had forced the Empire to retreat. But the fight was far from over. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the jagged skyline, the battlefield fell eerily silent once more. Yakran stood at the edge of the Imperial encampment, his gaze lingering on the distant human fortifications. "They've proven themselves," he murmured, speaking only to himself. "Perhaps more than we ever could."